Coming up, it's the return of the English voice of the top 14, Robbie Nock. How has the season been going? What do we think about promotion and relegation? And who's really behind the massive depth in the French men's national squad? Stick around to find out. This is the Scrum of the Earth. Hello, cheers, and welcome to the Scrum of the Earth podcast, your go-to for news, reviews, great interviews, and so much more, all about the world of rugby. My name is David Lawrence. I'm an American rugby fan who follows the game wherever I can find it all over the globe. If you'd like to get in touch, I'm easy to find on all your socials, and you can always just drop a good old-fashioned email to thescrumoftheearth@gmail.com. Well, as you have no doubt deduced, this is yet another bonus episode. Today, I'm beyond thrilled to welcome back a favorite returning guest. If you're like me and follow French rugby as closely as you can, you'll know him as the English voice of the top 14. It's the inimitable Robbie Nock. Robbie, so great to see you. Welcome back, and how the heck are you?
Oh, thanks very much. I'm going to call you Di instead of David. You know, it's the Welsh shortened name. I think it's going to suit you perfectly. Listen,
Di Laws has a ring to it.
There we go, Di Lawrence. That's going to be your commentary, name now. You've been tagged. Listen, the Scrum of the Earth back here. So happy to be, talking with you, David. It's always a thrill. It's always good to touch base with someone who's got that knowledge from the other side of the pond that we want to know a little bit more about as well, because everything's going to shift over there, and then in a few years' time after Australia. So we're going to be closely connected, even more connected than we are now.
Well, if my skill isn't having the knowledge, it's knowing who to go to get it. So that's why you're back. In fact, you're not at home right now. You're in Morocco right now. I'm assuming that's basketball related.
Yeah, sometimes I lose my OS map and my compass, and I got a little bit taken by the south. So I followed the little arm that was twitching, and it headed towards Morocco. I'm in Morocco to do some not rugby commentary, which I have done in Africa actually before, but I'm actually doing basketball commentary for the Basketball Africa League, which is a league in its 6th season. We're here in Morocco for the Sahara Conference, and it's NBA endorsed along with FIBA. So it's a bigger and better competition than it was 6 years ago. Flying into the 6th season, it's fantastic, and it's very enthralling, exciting, and great to watch and follow.
Well, basketball was the first sport that kind of caught my eye, so I always loved that. In fact, the international basketball tournaments I find I like better than the NBA. The World Championships, I love that tournament.
Yeah, mix of a clash of different styles of basketball. Of course, European basketball is different to the NBA. There's a lot of really good team play that's put together in Europe, of course, and I think that the individuals really sort of turn it on in the NBA. Without saying anything negative, because it's a team game, and then in Africa, the physicality and the incredible drama that you get in this Basketball Africa League is literally off the charts. So there's a little bit of everything coming in, because we've got some G League players coming in. Even this year we've got an NBA champion in Axel Tuvana, the former Milwaukee Bucks player. Didn't really play too many games, but is part of the one of the teams that's playing here this year. So I mean, it's going to be very interesting, but love the basketball.
I also love in international basketball, the refs are far more empowered, like they are in rugby, where they can be like, you know what, you're jawing at me too much, and they'll penalize you. And there's no superstar treatment in international ball, which I love.
Yeah, it's interesting. We got G League referees that come over from the States, Mexico, and they combine with FIBA officials, referees from Africa. So you've got this really interesting sort of mix, and the rules literally they're FIBA rules, but FIBA rules are a little bit different sort of in different parts of the world. So when they combine it, it creates something very interesting. So they've got to make a few adjustments to actually get themselves from G League rules to FIBA rules, and and make those quick adjustments. But they're pretty strict. They're very good, most of them. So it's always good.
We use the trapezoidal lane instead of the rectangular lane, like I've seen in FIBA. And what about the cylinder rule? Is obviously in the NBA, no touchy when it's above the cylinder.
No, stay away from that.
Interesting. By the way, you and I both love rugby. We apparently both love basketball. What's another sport that you love that I might not know about? What can you suggest?
Well, I've commentated on strange sports in my time. Um, I actually like I, I I like to commentate diving, and I've done a lot of snowboarding as well and freestyle skiing.
Wow. A
Yeah.
lot of people have told me that I would like cricket, but you know what I like more than that? Staying married. So I'm going to stay away.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, as what was it? Yeah, cricket's a very can be a very long, long game to follow.
Seems like a commitment.
Yeah, well, you literally, you if you follow your national team, then you could, be separated from your home for, anything up to like sort of, 6 weeks.
You know. So as people who have heard you on the show before know, you're essentially, for me at least, you're the voice of the top 14. I love listening to you in those broadcasts. I am curious, but as you know, commentating is something I'm trying to get into. You are on a beach sometimes. They leave you as a solo commentator a lot. What is that like? Do you feel like, a huge different amount of pressure?
Unfortunately, you get familiarized with that situation. I mean, you can always pretend to have an alter ego and sort of change your voice a little bit and pretend that you've actually got sort of, a world class fly half sat next to you, or a very large front rower who's like sort of going to talk about the dark arts of the scrummaging. But unfortunately, it's not the case. You actually, it's not daunting. I think that you just you when you start off, you're always on your own anyway. I think that in commentary. So by the time that you actually become good enough, you get maybe the chance to get a consultant because there's maybe more money within the work that you're doing and who you're working for, or you end up just working literally with someone on site, which is obviously sort of the do all and end all of commentary. That's where you want to be. That's how it should be. In an
Hmm.
ideal world, if you take away the financial restrictions. I'm good with it because I think that, just like yourself, we like to talk. And I don't like to just fill gaps with, nonsense and sort of, blabber. I think that you try and prepare yourself to the point where you're actually good enough to cover for that second person. So it's not daunting; it's more challenging, but also comes to the preparation. But I'm also a believer that sort of you do commentate to the images. Head down into facts. Sometimes is not the right way to go. You've really got to watch what's happening because you can pick up on things. And I think that if you've got a good eye, which you need to have as a commentator in sport, especially fast moving sport like rugby, where there's so many bodies all over the place. It's not sort of, easy to observe and pick out different, elements of the game. I think that sort of, it basically means that there's non-stop information that you can pass on to the person who's watching, and hopefully you don't bore them to tears so that they just, fall asleep and drop their cocoa, or hopefully a very large glass of good, Burgundy wine or whatever, and then slip off their couch. You want them enthralled, and you want them to sort of pick up on what you've got. So I find a good mix to try and keep them happy, and to replace the person who's not there.
One of the things that's always stood out for me that you do particularly well, I think, and because sometimes you are play by play and color, it kind of frees you up in a way where you're able to let the game breathe a little bit. Sometimes you will give it a pause, just let the images tell the story instead of trying to fill every single second. And I think that gives it a great flavor, and it's one of the things you do well. Is that something you sort of had to work on?
I think that there's nothing worse than having people talk for for the sake of talking. I think that if there is a moment, you know just let it breathe. It's so important. If you're working in radio, it's a different scenario. There's nothing to look at, so you will sort of you can go hammer and tongs and sort of and have your tonsils sort of try and dance back into your mouth because they've had enough at the end of the match or whatever. But I think that for television, have it. There's so much there to look at. There's so much that you can take in that I think that sort of, you need that to happen. And I think that you've got these magical moments, like the Pena Bayona at the start of the Bayonne home game at Jean Daugé in the wonderful southwest Basque region of France, where they're all in fine voice. And being a Welshman, I understand how important it is to sort of, just listen, to great sounds. And I love sound. Sound is fantastic, and it's important for each and every one of us, even those who are unable to hear because they pick up on the vibrations. So it's so important. I think that those moments there, you have to let them go and let people just say, right, okay, this is magical, and that's one of those moments where you just say, let it breathe, just shut up the chops and let the people listen.
No, the top 14, I love this competition, and it's going great. Again, we were through 21 rounds as we speak here today. Robbie, what's been your overall impression? Like, give us just a simple 1 to 10 rating, how good the season has been for you.
It's been fantastic. Do you know why, David? Because we've seen new teams popping up and teams that promised so much at the start of the season. I did a season preview going into the new season, which really made me very happy because I got to really listen to the players, with interviews that were, where they stand, what kind of budget they've got, who are the acquisitions coming in, how they, preparing themselves, new training grounds, new players, and new combinations. I think, and you look at all of these factors, these elements, and you go, okay, well, what's going to happen? Who's going to follow through? I personally have been completely mesmerized by Poe and what they've managed to do. Because the section
very next question on my list, of course.
It's always the same. You always know what I'm going to say, but I think that sort of, Poe have been the team that they said our mission. Sebastian Piccioni said our mission, and this was in the preview, is that we're going to make it into the top 6 for the very first time ever.
Wow.
Look where they are. They're in second position.
Smashing that expectation.
Yeah, they 2 more wins potentially, and they'll probably be in the playoffs. And I think that's mission accomplished. I love that, and I think that you've got a coach who's signed a new contract until 2029, which is just bonkers. It just basically tells you that I think he's the only coach who's managed to get over a certain number of wins since Simon Mannix, who's a friend of mine, and now the head coach of Portugal, brought them up from Pro D2. So they haven't gone through so many changes. They've just gone through smart changes to get them to a point where they actually sort of are preparing themselves. And you go through the undulating roller coaster ride of getting yourself into a qualification position, but they've just been so constant. And and when you look at when you've got more players that have been chosen to play within the French team from Pau than sort of than all of the other teams besides Toulouse and Bordeaux. I think that it gives you a good idea that something's
nice. Kind of froze there right at the end, but I think I got it. I'm glad that you mentioned that. You absolutely read my mind. Toulouse at the top, that's not a surprise to anyone. But for me, seeing Poe in that second slot was a huge surprise. I had to hit refresh a few times just to make sure I was seeing that correctly. What I'm curious about is, because they've exceeded expectations, when they hit that knockout stage, is that going to be Bordeaux had that thing where they were getting better and better, and they had this great record, but then they would kind of Toulouse would have their number, when it came down to the final strokes. Is that going to be difficult for Poe to get to that, to get success in the postseason?
If they get to the semi-finals, honestly, you'll consider that as a great success, and that's where they want to be. I think that if they can get themselves into the playoffs and win their barrage, I don't know if they're going to finish in the top 2. If they do, then there's already, completely, secured their mission to do what they wanted to do. I don't know if they'll finish second. I think that there'll be a surge and a few changes happening. And I think that sort of, honestly, I see them finishing third or fourth, to be honest with you. I think that Montpellier will probably finish second in the way that they're playing, or UBB. You just asked me the question about 1 to 10, which I didn't even answer. I would probably say it's been a riveting 9, just from the chopping and the changing and the refreshing teams that are coming through to showing us that they can actually brandish armory and get results on the road. I think that that's been fantastic. But Poe, they'll get to the semi-finals. Will they get to the final? I am not too sure. They might come up against Toulouse, in the semi-finals, and what's going to, if they get lucky, who knows? They could get in there. I don't like seeing, the same scenario every year. And I know that sort of Toulouse are the blockbusters of French rugby. I just think that sort of, maybe there'll be a little shift coming soon, and I think we saw that in Europe. So I think that maybe it won't just be UBB who'll manage to beat them. I think maybe someone else will. But Montpellier, watch out. That's what I can say. I look across the team, and they've got players and backup in every single position.
Like you're reading my mind, Robbie. I don't know how you do it. My very next item, Montpellier. A lot of new faces. It's really been working out for them. I've been really impressed. They're currently in third, and like you said, they have a sniff at getting maybe top 2. Like you mentioned, you did a preview. Did you see that coming?
Montpellier, possibly not, because I don't think anybody did. I think that they're always one of those teams who hover, and if they don't get it right, if they don't have the right coach, they don't find the right mix to get them moving in the right direction. They have a very good mix. And I think one of my standout favorite players is Tom Banks, the Australian fullback, who has just been lightning, quick.
I love him.
So smart, so good with a real typical 15, Australian Southern Hemisphere 15, who's big, he's strong, whose running lines are just always decisive. He reads the game so well, finds space, and makes the pass to teammates, who just canter off and scuttle off to score the tries. He's been outstanding. He's been so good in the air, and when you've got a player like that in that position, is possibly keeping out Stuart Hogg, who has to go on the wing. And I think that, you've got internationals, ex-internationals, if you like, who can sort of, fit into different positions. And you've got cover right across each of the different, positions across the field, and a big bench. You're in a good place. They defensively really hold themselves up very well, which has been kind of one of their trademarks over the years. But it's been very South African orientated, with Jake White, who was the man who sort of, came over a handful of years ago and basically brought half of South Africa with him. It's not the case anymore. There's a whole mix, and there's a right mix, and they've got internationals of different countries. Adam Beard from Wales, Tyler de Guide from Canada. I think you got Nushi, the French international, who's sort of raised his game, and he's right. Galtier's saying, I'm going to bring him in. So you've got so much quality players, but they're not like superstars. They're just they're better than average players. Maybe go underneath the radar as being sort of world rugby players in that position, but they so well fit into the Montpellier DNA. And I think that they've got one of their own as their coach, Joanne Cordello, who came in kind of like sort of a cover coach, and finally finds himself as the number one, who's doing a great job.
Again, you already kind of mentioned it. I'll prove it. I'm a Bordeaux bag supporter, and I was surprised just before we chatted to go and check, and again I had to kind of shake my head. Only 5th place right now, and Stade Francais is ahead of them. I'm just still disappointed that I can no longer call Stade Francais the drink boxes. But what's been the key to their they've sort of figured it out this year?
Well, Stade Francais, it's an interesting. Paul Gustard, he knows French rugby very well. He's slowly got himself from being defense coach, moving in to be the head coach. It's a very fascinating scenario in France where sometimes they don't look for a replacement outside of the team. They bring in, defense coaches or assistant coach, or, it can be a backs coach. And suddenly they get promoted into that position. And then, they find themselves, all alone, in that beautiful position where, they've signed a contract. It might not be the big money contract that they were looking for as they were, headhunted as a head coach, but they're still, getting pretty good money. They will keep them happily, living in France, in a system that sort of, gives you quite a lot of time off and a lot of good food available on your front door with the Vino Rouge and Blanc. I think that Gustard's done a brilliant job. He's good. He's very much brought the right coaches in to work alongside him. They don't make too much noise but work hard. The likes of Morgan Parra, smart number 9, played at the highest level. Perry Freshwater's come from Perpignan. He's been down there for 21 years. And then all of a sudden he's like sort of, the scrum coach who's been brought up and working alongside him. But, it's no noise, it's work, it's graft. And I think that everybody, everything that they've done, they brought Stade Francais really into a good position. They win a few matches on the road, like that thumping victory against Toulon down at Stade Maillot, which was like sort of, shook up Toulon big time. The Armada, was sort of, wobbling all over the place down in the Mediterranean. And the Pink Army were like sort of, just rubbing their hands going, a win away is worth 2 at home sometimes, because it's fantastic. And, so they've, and Tuera Kerbala, what a brilliant acquisition at number 9, 34 years of age, a former New Zealander, still got what it takes. The passing is probably, I was saying this to Andrew Mertens the other night. I said, he's probably the best passer of the ball in world rugby today. It's like sort of, so precise. It goes right to hands. Incredible. I'm not on about the sneaky Finn Russell, around the back and everything. I'm just on about being very much, clockwork in terms of getting the ball to the right person at the right time without doing any of the wizardry that Finn Russell and co do.
There's no science behind this feeling of mine, but I feel like Super Rugby players really fit into the top 14 style more so than they do when they go to the Premiership, when they go to the URC. They tend to struggle there more. I see a lot of success, like you're talking about, like Banks, although I think Banks was also a Wallaby as well. But do you feel that connection between Super Rugby skills translating in France?
Not all the time. I mean, there are players who've just not made it, that just didn't work out. And I think that sort of, you've got to have the right mindset to come to France, and you've got to work hard. You've got to work in a French way. The French don't work like anybody else, in club rugby. It's a very different beast, But I think that if you come here and you want to work, sorry,
how so?
I think that in France, when you speak with players who come across, they find that they really have to like sort of make a massive adjustment, and try and fit in socially. And a lot of players who don't have that capacity will find it very lonely. Fijians who don't find other Fijians in French rugby clubs don't fit in. It's very rare that they actually bond with, foreigners. And, to a point where they don't have that family connection in their club. So a lot of the time you see the Fijians, there's 2, 3, sometimes a lot of them, like there was with Breve about 10 years ago, where you could literally, it was like double figures to a certain extent, and it was beautiful. And I think that sort of, that thing of being, homesick, very much has an element of, a serious effect on international players who come from so far away. Australia is not like sort of a 2-hour journey, a 2-hour flight to England. It's, or a 4-hour flight, I don't know, to sort of, Beirut, or I don't know where. The fact is, it's a massive long distance. And if you leave your family to come and do a stint, or you bring your family over, everything's got to be, perfect. So it's not everybody, everybody's cup of tea, because the first thing that you want to do if you come over and you bring your family is your family's got to be happy first. And clubs in France accommodate for that very well. But there are certain, situations that don't work out. Especially when players come over, maybe they're on their own, maybe they sort of, got an ego or something, and it's complicated. So it doesn't work out all the time.
Interesting. It's a great point too, especially about the Pacific Islanders. My Free Jacks, we had a player named Paula Balacana who showed all this promise in his first year here, and he was obviously really good. the next year, all of a sudden, he's smiling more, and his play just elevated. And all of us were going, "What happened? What happened?" And the answer was his family arrived. They brought his family over to live with him, and he didn't have that the year before, and magic, the difference.
It's crazy. It really is. And I full credit to those who decide to move abroad and start a life elsewhere. I did it in France myself, so I know exactly what it's like. And away from your family, it can be complicated. For us Welsh, it's complicated, and we're only like
Mm.
sort of an hour and a half, flight to Cardiff. But it's still, something that you've got to do. And then afterwards, you've got to learn the language and the culture and everything. And it's not like anything, that we're familiar with. We can talk about, the camembert cheese and the red wine and the baguette and everything. It's a lot more profound than that. And it's a lot more intricate. And there's so much to deal with. And if you don't have anybody doing your administration, which is normally the case when you're a rugby player, pro, there's team managers and they speak English and they help you and, take you underneath their wing and guide you through, the very early teething stages of your, of your adaptation. And but if you don't get that, it's a nightmare. So, or a cauchemar, as they say in French. And and I promise you, it can be very tricky. So yeah, it's tough.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because I'm a lover of language. There is a huge cultural difference between France and most of the other rugby playing nations that I typically see. And I just wonder, as a commentator, and obviously you're deeply fluent at this point, do you ever find yourself thinking, boy, how am I going to translate what that guy just said so that American audiences, so that English audiences will understand what it means? Like I've always thought it was funny that the word Schadenfreude is German, because of course it is, and I always thought insouciance, of course that's a French word. You know what I mean? There's subtle elements. Are you ever in your head going, "Gee, how do I translate this so it'll make sense?"
I listen. I'm just so glad that we don't really have rocket scientists who like to play professional rugby, because I'd be in deep poop. I really would. It would not be a great place for me, because I think that sort of in that very small 60-second to answer moment, if you go into the technical aspects of sort of why the wires are wired differently around the rear side of the battery that's connected to the combustible materials that line up towards the converter, I'm going to be in trouble.
Well, you could just lean back on that insouciance again. Um, the way so I don't want to. They're the kind of obvious thing to talk about, but I love them, and despite being a Bordeaux supporter, I love watching Toulouse play. They're well deserving to be at the top once again. They've scored 20 more tries than the next closest team, and they've scored 163 more points than the number two team. That's completely outrageous. And they're nowhere in the top five for tackles made, which you don't have to really worry about when you're an offensive juggernaut, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, because Toulouse are a machine. They yeah, they've even got the best defensive, and they just which is just a little bit better than Montpellier, who as I said, have got a robust defensive line. They they can't do everything right, but they do a lot right. And when they don't get something right, then they work on that during the week. It's not often
Mm.
that they get bumped off, the perch. Um, they were well beaten against by your team UBB, in the Champions Cup quarterfinals. They deserve to lose that game, but they won't like the disciplinary, scenario of that game. They won't like the line out situation that has been
Mm.
giving them a bit of a bad knock on effect in the top 14. They would have comfortably dealt with Castres if they would have won their attacking lineouts. These are the areas which they work on, and they make it very meticulous. That they need to sort it out, whether it's John Boyer working with them, or who any of these Toulousains who know how important it is to get it all right. The small things. It's all about the small details. They always talk about the small details. You get that right, and it's sorted.
Is there, kerfuffle about their salary cap? I saw some sort of thing recently about, Toulouse, they're overpaying, they got caught again and stuff, but it doesn't feel like anyone really cares too much.
Well, I mean, they've got money, haven't they, David? They're in a pretty good position. I think that sort of, yeah, they will go to court, I think, at the end of the month, and they might pick up a fine. Will they have an issue buying players, future players, or will they have to just like sort of have a little bit of a lockdown for the moment? Yes, maybe. I think that we'll get to see what happens, but they are going to court, and they will be, stung with quite a large, bill. But I think that when they get that bill, they'll say, "Oh yeah, okay, we just have to sell a few more shirts." So they'll probably go on some kind of an advertising, run, and everything will just fall back into place. That's how big clubs work.
It was that time when Michael Jordan was playing, and his shoes, his Air Jordans, didn't match the required team colors, and the NBA is very specific about you have to have team colors for your shoes, and so they fined him something like $20,000 a game for every game that he was wearing those shoes. But guess what? Nike was paying him $250,000, so he was like, "Here's your fine."
There you go. It's as simple as that, isn't it? I mean, what goes around comes around, and Toulouse are just there's it's such a it's such a good business. It's such a strong business that I really not too worried. You always look up and you say, "Oh wow, this is going to hit them hard," and then you go, "No, it really won't." They won't like it, but they'll hit back by winning something that will give them the money back in the pot that will just iron out the creases, and they'll say, we'll not do that again."
Somebody once told me rich guys don't get rich by spending money. Looking at the other end of the table, Perpignan, they're again sort of flirting with the dregs, but Montauban, they look firmly fated to go back down, having just one win and single-digit table points. Robbie, this was always going to go poorly, right?
It's such a difficult scenario for a team that comes up so late in the Pro D2. So
they seem surprised.
They were sixth, and no one expected them to go up. So I think that if you get yourself into the sixth place in the penultimate round of Pro D2, and then you say, "Oh yeah, we're in that sixth position. We're going to try and get ourselves." Whereas no one thought that they would be the team that would actually go through. You don't have much time to get players to come in. You don't have the ability. All of the top players that that have been singled out have been signed up already, coming from abroad or elsewhere. So it's difficult to get the team. Papi came in and just as well he did, but otherwise, I mean, they were just like looking at not quality players that they could actually sort of say, right, okay, we got a fighting chance of staying mid-table. It was like, we're going to fight to stay in the top 14, and it's going to be so difficult because we don't have the competitive, and we don't have the money. They get that lump sum of money, but it's not enough for them to bring in sort of the equivalent of Tom Banks and sort of et cetera, so right. It's logical.
Well, I'm curious what your own opinion on this. Like, so if I'm right, the top 14, well, I should say the top 14 is the only competition that I know of that still uses promotion and relegation. The Premiership have never gone back to it since they scrapped it. So on one hand, you get this sort of revolving door. The 14th team is up this year and down the next year, up this year and down the next year. But in sports, we want stories, we want drama, and we want to overcome things. And you mentioned Poe. They had to come up at some point, and now here they are sitting in second place. What's better? Should most competitions be thinking about this? What's the lesson from promotion and relegation?
Keep it alive and kicking. I mean, I've always lived it. I've in the leagues that I've been commentating, I've only seen it, and I think that that's fantastic. I think it's important to have the drama. There's nothing better than the access match, and then
my favorite match of the year.
Don't want to talk, about Sam Davis and Grenoble, but I mean, Montpellier, They only just managed to stay up 2 seasons ago, and then look where they are now. They're in third position. It's bonkers. David, it's
Yeah.
bonkers. Le Top 14 is nuts. And it's fantastic in the way that it just churns up all of this crazy stuff that's taking place. You look away, you go on holiday for 3 weeks if you're blessed to have that money to go on holiday and sort of, go down to Barbados or wherever you guys hang out in the States, which is always beautiful because you got the Caribbean to the south. You come back, if you haven't looked at the Top 14, what on earth's gone up? What happened? It's madness. It's like chopping and changing. It's like sort of, I don't know, juggling fireballs, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in a crazy world, and it's like sort of, and Power in second place, Montpellier third.
I can't believe you mentioned Sam Davis specifically because he's a player I picked out early in my sort of rugby following days, and I was like, I love this guy. And I've talked to all my Welsh friends, said, why Sam Davis never got a sniff with Wales? Why is that? Most people said just not big enough. I don't know. I love him as a player, though.
I think that it's just the wrong time. There was good Welsh tens at the time, and I think that sort of there's nothing not good about him. I just think that sort of he's just been a little bit unlucky. He's had a few injuries. Didn't manage to sort of just nailed the matches that he's played. He found himself in a Welsh team that sort of wasn't firing. It's so difficult when you actually play for the national team. You lose the games and you expect to be the number one player in that position. Because the whole team's going through a little bit of a quagmire. Trek. So it's not easy for players, who don't get the right result and don't get the right result, and they don't play well against the top teams, because there's going to be change following that normally.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm worried about Rio Dyer. Spending his entire career with the Dragons could, I think, negatively impact.
Dragons are in the semi-finals of the Challenge Cup. Watch out! There's something going on there.
I know. I do like it.
They beat Stade Francais at Jean-Bouin, by, was it 38-35? Fabulous result, and
really
something in the water.
Yeah. By the way, shout out to Dragon supporters who show up no matter what. I love the scene there. It's great. Player that we all will be missing, I'm sure you as much as anyone. He might have been my all-time favorite player. Winnie Antonio, that was a terrible blow and just terrible news for him. Do you have any insights on how he's doing? Is it the start of a long recovery process, or is it just kind of don't play rugby?
I think that he needs to be very careful. I think that sort of, any kind of a heart issue when you're 140 kilos, you've got to probably make a few changes. We saw him at Marcel de Flandre, up in the one of the boxes, the players' boxes behind, where they can hang out and watch the game, with a little bit of charcuterie and maybe a glass of wine. I think that maybe he wasn't having a charcuterie and a glass of wine. He was trying to be a little bit careful, because I think that, with a massive scare like that, he's got to be very wary of, what he eats, how he is. He's got to look at his weight. So logically, his heart won't allow him to play rugby again. But if he's up bouncing around, shouldn't say bouncing around, but walking around Marcel de Flandre, and with a smile on his face, and part of the staffing setup, which is fantastic for him, because he came up with the Stade Rochelet into the top 14 as a Pro D2 player, and he should stay in the staff, right away, once he can, but it's slowly but surely. He's on the road to recovery.
Somewhere there's a VHS tape of him performing Shakespeare as a schoolboy, and I'm on a quest to find that thing.
I wonder what it would be. Would he be playing like sort of, Duncan from Macbeth, or who would he be? I don't know. I'm just trying to think.
I want him to be Rosencrantz and a really little guy to be Guildenstern.
That would be fun. Yeah, that's probably the case.
Well, that's my artificial little connector to bring us to the men's national team. They just had their second straight Six Nations win, and you got it pretty emphatically, on top of which they did so with, overall squad selections that had a lot of people shaking their heads, including myself, before this tournament. Fabien Galthié, he announced he had this long-term plan to sort of get three deep at every single position, and then after leaving out the likes of Gail Fickou and Damien Penaud, and then just smashing the Six Nations, is this proof? Is Fabien Galtier probably the best coach in the world, maybe second to Razzie?
Oh, they're two different coaches with two different ways of working with different player selection. Um, yeah, I'd let him win a World Cup and then we'll talk about it. Now he's got to try and sort of step it up. Next year will be a big one for him to see what he can do with Australia, because if he's got everything in place and he's got the likes of Romain Tamac, as the second to Jalabert, and Dupont's not injured, and you've got like sort of Le Garec who's the, that's, if you've got all of your players and he can drive them through and they can win a World Cup, I'll say he's one of the best coaches that we've ever seen. But you know what? Fabien Galtier wasn't the mastermind behind this collective, selection. It came from Bernard Laporte. So Bernard Laporte was behind this. This was his project, and it's a game plan that was implemented the moment that he was like sort of, behind the French national team. It's like, gather the numbers, bring in as many as possible, work through a whole system that sort of, gets implemented so that you bring hordes of great players or potentially great players and give them a taste. Napoleon worked on, having big armies, but he didn't just have big armies. He had big armies that were consistent. Some great, some not so great, but pretty much around the middle zone and upwards. So he's enabled himself to protect himself with all of these great soldiers, who could hold their own. Galtier's doing the same thing. He's a little bit taller than Napoleon, but he's very much big in terms of his ideas and the way that he's actually, gathered the masses. It works an absolute treat. But Bernard Laporte's behind it.
Interesting. I think it was Napoleon who said, above all, give me lucky generals. So maybe he's also got that going on.
He wants like sort of, as many as possible, 45 if he can, going into each campaign.
Losing a home World Cup after all the hype and expectations, pundits at the time when France got knocked out said, "Oh, this could be huge. This could be something they can't recover from. This could be a psychological blow." It doesn't really look like that to me. Do you think that hangover is well and truly in the rearview mirror?
The French are emotional, and they're very they're very moody. They're also don't forget things overnight. They also they're romantic, and they're also French. And I think that you combine all of those elements, and if anything goes wrong in their mindset, preparing themselves for a Rugby World Cup on the way, if they get destabilized, the whole juggernaut will shake and the wheels will fall off the wagon. And that's the unfortunate truth of it. If it stays together and they've got all of the pieces, and they can see the finish line, they could go quite competently all the way. But you lose some of their corner pieces to the puzzle, and that's when it becomes complicated. They don't like to be destabilized, and to have big hits of injury losses during an important campaign and the build up to the World Cup and the World Cup itself. I think that that's it's going to hit them hard, and unfortunately they suffer, and they don't know how to deal with that. So if you've got adjustments to make on the pitch during a match where you've lost two players to a red card and a yellow card against South Africa, if they can find a way of dealing with that on the pitch, then they can get through it. If they can't, they'll lose and they won't be able to deal with it. And that comes to sort of, psychological preparation. And I think that they need to make sure that they've got all of the preparation, the mental preparation from the right personnel to get themselves, pushing themselves to fight against Razzie and South Africa, or the rank outsiders for World Cup victory, Wales. I had to throw that in, of course, David. It would be It would be rude for me not to, brother.
You know, after another Scarlets collapse, I had a couple of my Welsh friends come on just to be like, the hell's going on with the Scarlets? And somehow that pod smashed all my numbers. People love misery. They love coming for the pods where you sit there and go, oh my God, what's wrong?
I know. Well, we're pretty good at like sort of, just moving moving ourselves into the doldrums of defeat and sort of, but we also, got a little bit of humor because we accept it and we move forward and we know that sort of, we always believe that there's grass, the grass is always greener on the other side. We wait to get to the other side and we'll make it.
Rory, I'm going to let you go. Real quick, who's going to win the top 14? And can my Border Beagles take Europe again?
Okay. UBB should be okay. And for the top 14, I kind of want to just cut the video now, die. I just say, I think that the top 14 winners are going to be...
Would be? There it is. Stick around to find out. By the way, are you watching the Women's Six Nations? Do France have a fighting chance against the Red Roses?
They always do. They always do. They're very physical, the English women's team, but they always do because they got some fabulous athletes and they're very they'll probably be the toughest team that England will come up against for sure. But I think they're playing in England. They're not playing in France this year, so it'll give the English an opportunity.
I think.
Yeah, it's going to be tricky, but who knows?
Wales women look improved though.
Yeah,
positive signs for the Wales women.
Yeah, if we can get a couple of wins, that would be good. That would be great. I mean, there's so many changes happening, and I think that what's happening with the federation, the WRU, and all of the changes and everything that's going on. There's so much movement. We just want the stability with the Ospreys as well, and what's happening there. It's just it's very difficult times for us, and it all comes down to that board and the wrong people and the wrong way of going about organizing a federation and reaching out to grassroots, enabling everything to go through a very healthy system. And I always lean on the Bernard Laporte and Fabien Galtier, collective gathering of players. The bigger the group, the more experience they have, and and the more options you have. I just think there's a really good way of going about things, and we need to get people who know about finance and sort of working with money properly so that everything goes in the right place, so that we do have 4 competitive teams rather than three, and the loss of a great team where Alan Wynne-Jones and everybody fought so hard for. The quality of players who've come out from the Ospreys and around Bridgend, Swansea, etc. is unreal. It's like it's a massive pool of talent that's going to be hit, but it's also the history of a club which is going down. I'll start weeping soon if you don't watch out, Di.
This weekend, I felt the tides of time of rugby passing by as I'm watching the URC and Liam Williams is in the booth, and I'm watching the Sevens and Portia Woodman-Wycliffe is doing comms. It's a different world.
Times they are a-changing, as one of your fabulous singers used to say.
Robbie Nock, you are a scholar and a gentleman. Thank you, as always, for your time and your insights. I really do appreciate it. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
What can I say? I can say sort of, just everybody keep smiling, difficult times in this world at the moment. Just be there for your brothers and sisters and your mothers, your fathers, your children. And, let's keep the love there. Peace as well. We love it.
Wise words. Robbie, thank you again. I love listening to you every weekend. It's always a treat. You're just the best. Cheers. Talk to you soon, my friend, and be well.
Bye-bye.